Kanupiam. My name is Silvermoon LaRose. I'm the Assistant Director of Tamaquag Museum, and it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce to you the second in our Culture Bearers series. Unfortunately, when we recorded this, we forgot to start the recording on time, so we wanted to make sure that we gave you the full introduction of tonight's speaker, James Vukelich. James Vukelich, Kaagegaabaw, is a descendant of Turtle Mountain, is an international speaker, author, and the creator of Ojibwe Word of the Day. His mission is to inspire people to live the good life by sharing ancient wisdom to influence modern solutions through an Indigenous perspective. James is recognized as a leading voice on the interconnectedness of language and culture. His keen insights were developed through speaking with and recording elders and native language speakers, many of whom have since passed on, in Canada, Michigan, and Minnesota as part of the Ojibwe Language Dictionary Project. For over 20 years, James has moved seamlessly through diverse settings, locally and internationally. In addition to keynote speeches for academic, philanthropic, business, and community organizations, he facilitates community roundtable groups and conducts spiritual ceremonies in his local community. He has consulted with school districts, colleges, historical societies, and government agencies to develop and teach language and cultural programs. He has also been featured on numerous podcasts, radio, and television programs, in addition to publications. When he is not speaking, writing, teaching, or traveling, James enjoys spending time with his wife and son in South Metro. So please enjoy tonight's presentation with James Vukelich.
I am Turtle Clan. I'm a descendant of Turtle Mountain. I live close to Minneapolis, Kaagegaabaw, the place of the falls, a city in Minnesota. And I'm incredibly grateful. I wanted to begin by thanking you all for watching and listening to this program, and to state that I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to speak this evening. And one of the topics I'm going to discuss is something that happens internationally in Indian country, this concept of 7 generations. And this shows up with a number of different nations. For example, in his prophecy, the Lakota warrior and holy man, Haka Sapa. You'll have to forgive my Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, it's very poor at best. But Black Elk, he prophesied of a time in 7 generations from when he lived, after that terrible battle at Wounded Knee, that it would take his people, the Lakota, a period of 7 generations to make the hoop of life whole again with the Wasichu, with the Americans. For him, this was a unit of time. One that profoundly affected me as a teenager. The first time I heard it came from the Haudenosaunee speaking people, the Iroquois. And when Degana, the great peacemaker, brought the great laws of peace to his people, he told them that in every one of your decisions, in every one of your deliberations, you are going to have to think 7 generations into the future. Now, the first time I heard that, I thought that was very profound, but it was also a little confounding. How do we do that? How do we come up with an action, a decision, a choice that will affect someone we'll never see, we'll never visit with, we'll never speak to, listen to, or hold? How do we come up with a decision that will affect someone 7 generations from now? And what I would like to present to you all this evening is an Ojibwe, Chippewa, Anishinaabeg perspective of that. Each one of those names is referring to the same tribal group. Our autonym, our name for ourselves, is Anishinaabeg. We also refer to ourselves as Ojibwe. And then when Ojibwe is incorporated into the English language, it will sound like Ochipaway, and it'll become Chipaway and then Chippewa. So all 3 of those names are referring to the same group. And when I said international, in Indian country, not everyone is familiar with this, but Ojibwe, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and Haudenosaunee are as different from one another as languages, comparatively speaking, as Somali, German, and Mandarin Chinese. 3 different languages spoken on 3 different continents by by 3 different races of people. And where we may share some physical, cultural, and spiritual characteristics, each one is its own proper nation with its own gifts to share with the world. So tonight, I always like to make sure that we know we're looking at an Ojibwe, Anishinaabeg, Chippewa perspective. And those are the words that we'll use tonight. I'd like to double check. Everyone can see 7 generations and 7 grandfathers, right? Fantastic. Here is our first generation. Now, this was originally a petroglyph, from petro, stone, and glyph to write. And now today we're using Keynote on Zoom. So the media has changed, but the message is still the same. And if we look at this first generation, we have Neen, that's I, me, myself. Here's our next generation, Nus and Ninga. Nus is our old word for my father. Ninga is our old word for my mother. Nowadays, you may hear in Dede or Mbaba or Namama for my mother. And Dede is probably borrowing from the English daddy. Papa, Baba is probably from the French papa, but these are very old words. And when I say old, our next generation, I think, will give us an insight in how old some of these words are. Nimishomis is my grandfather. Nokomis is my grandmother. And I think we could make a case for this sound, nokom, in how it shows up in so many different Algonquian languages. I think we could make a really strong scientific case that that sound, nokom, dates back to prior to the ending of the last ice age. So even where you're at in the eastern seaboard, and certainly where I'm at here in Minnesota, there were people who saw the mountain of ice before Gitchigami, the great sea of the Anishinaabeg, existed, Lake Superior. There were people who saw woolly mammoths, saber-toothed tigers. Missamik, that's our word for giant beaver. And when we say giant, Missamik was about the size of a makwa, a black bear. And if you can imagine the size of makwa at the time, he stood around 11 to 12 feet tall on his hind legs. There was someone who saw all of these magnificent megafauna, who saw a mountain of ice, who most likely referred to his or her grandfather using that sound, nokom. We don't know what the ending would have sounded like, but I think we could make a pretty strong guess that that first sound, nokom, was there. And I love to share that with people because often people forget that our history does not begin with contact. It is something that dates back millennia upon millennia here on the land. And so our next generation then would be Indonakobitchigan. Indonakobitchigan. My great-grandparent, my great-grandmother, or my great-grandfather. But that word doesn't just mean that. In it, we will find a morpheme. And a morpheme is the smallest part of a word that carries meaning. Here, the morpheme is unik. And with my background, my graduate studies were in linguistics. And when I was studying morphology, I began looking and taking a scientific approach on where these certain morphemes show up in different words, the environments they show up in, what they mean, with the hope that it would give me a better understanding of what someone was trying to say 150 years ago, 400 years ago, maybe even 800 years ago, or even thousands of years ago, if we look at some of those family terms. Anik shows up in Anikanutake. And I'm grateful I've had an opportunity to do this a number of times already this evening. It's to translate. It's to say a word in one language and then repeat that in the target language of your audience. Our next word is Anike Ogamakwe. This is a vice president, a vice superintendent, a vice chief. It's someone who fulfills the role of the current leader if the current leader can no longer do so. That kwe suffix denotes a woman. So this is a nod to Vice President Harris. Our next word is Anishinaabeg. And there's a number of these where I grew up in north central Minnesota. Chains of lakes, bodies of water that are interconnected. And then Anishinaabeg. I don't know if we have any bead workers, sewers, people who maybe even quilt, but when you've run out of thread and you tie one piece of thread to the next, you've interconnected them. They become one piece. So this idea of Anik, when I asked an elder about it, a fluent first language speaker, he looked at me and he knew I had a Western background, a Western education. And he thought for a moment, and then he said, it's a lot like a bike chain. From his perspective, we could see here my great-grandparents, my grandparents, my parents, and myself, all links in a chain. So this idea of Anishinaabeg, Indanikobichigan would be my great-grandparent, my great-grandmother, my great-grandfather. You can also translate that to my ancestor. That person I was speaking about thousands of years ago, who saw woolly mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, and the mountain of ice, I can refer to him or her as Indanikobichigan. But I think if we were to spiritually translate that phrase, spiritually translate that word, it would mean that being I am inextricably interconnected to. That being I am inextricably linked to. And it's also the word we use for my great-grandchild. We use the same term for one another, my great-grandparent, my great-grandchild. Sometimes I ask myself, I wonder if they are actually saying, I am you. So if we look at a petroglyph like this holistically, if it works going up, it should work going down. So here we have Nin, I, me, myself. I have Engosis, it's my son. Endonis is my daughter. Nujis, this may also sound like Nuzis, depending on where you're at. The northern part of Ojibwe-speaking country or the southern part. This is if you're addressing my grandchild, my grandson, or my granddaughter. Nujis, Nujishayak would be my grandchildren. And then, of course, we have my great-grandchildren, Indanikobichigan. And they call me Indanikobichigan. And so what we have here, if we look at that word logically, it presents in just one word, the idea of 7 generations. And this idea of that I am inextricably interconnected to you, I am inextricably linked to you, is punctuated intergenerationally. And I think that's very beautiful. Often I'll be asked, well, how do you say 7 generations in Ojibwe? And that may even be too clumsy of a term. Not when I can use a word like Indanikobichigan, my great-grandparent, my great-grandchild, because that implies in one moment 7 generations. And the first time I looked at this had a number of teachings for me. This idea of interconnection, this idea of sequence that show up both spiritually and scientifically. One of the spiritual teachings I recognized right away, you may not recognize this word right away in Sanskrit, but it's karma. Often this word will be mistranslated as the law of cause and effect. But in it, there's the root word kri, which is to your actions, your deeds. So you can develop good karma. You've acted with benevolence, with kindness, with generosity, with altruistic goodwill towards all of your relatives. Or you can develop bad karma. Maybe you've acted with greediness, with meanness, or even malevolence. The idea is how you act, that is what will come back to you. Whatever happens to you, that is your karma. This will show up, this idea shows up in a number of East Asian religions. In the Middle East, in the New Testament, this will show up as, you shall reap what you sow. Whatever seed you have planted in the ground, that is what you should expect to grow. Jesus may even be more explicit when he states that if you live by the sword, you will die by the sword. Your actions will have a reaction. From an Ojibwe perspective, an Anishinaabe perspective, your actions will have a reaction that will echo intergenerationally. Now, this will show up as a law of physics. The third law is for every action, there's going to be an equal reaction. And the first time I saw a double helix, I was taken aback because what I saw here were links in a chain. And when I asked myself, well, what did I inherit from my great-grandparents? What will I pass down to my great-grandchildren? It'll be my DNA. It'll be the very building blocks of our being. And this was something that I wanted to take into account, maybe take a brief moment to discuss here, the idea that we may, in our long and complicated relationship, may have inherited someone's pain and trauma that is not our own. When I think of my great-grandfather's experience, he was born in 1875. There were times he must have slept in a teepee. He would have eaten on the plains of North Dakota, Montana, and Saskatchewan. He would have eaten buffalo. And in his life, he would go through a great deal of change. He would lose his liberty. He would see the creation of the reservation, and he could not leave the reservation without express written consent from the Indian agent. If he did otherwise, he would have been deemed a hostile. I think a more modern contemporary term for that would be an enemy combatant, where the United States military could engage with him and kill him. He would lose his spiritual freedom. Before we began, I took a moment to smudge. Here's wing gush, sweetgrass. I use this on a daily basis, and I introduced myself in our language. In his day and age, that was an arrestable offense. Until 1978, that was an arrestable offense. He wouldn't have done hard time, maybe a night or two in jail, but that would have been a day or two's wages lost. That could have been, he may not get his rations because he couldn't hunt or fish, again, without written consent. And he would go through a huge loss, the loss of the family structure. His children would go to a boarding school, and his grandchildren would go to a boarding school. My mother went to a boarding school. My grandmother went to a boarding school. My grandfather and my uncles went to boarding school as well. And these were total institutions. These were places where what you ate, the clothes you wore, the books you read, the language you spoke, when you used the bathroom, when you lined up, when you went outside. All of these things were determined for you by the institution. There are two perfect examples of this. One would be the military, the other prison. So we have had a number of generations of people who did not grow up with the language, who did not grow up with the culture, who, as we're learning through Truth and Reconciliation in Canada at least, went through a great deal of abuse, trauma, mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, and sexual abuse. And so if we do not begin the healing, and I think we need to talk about this for a brief moment, because if we are not aware of this, that trauma may have been passed down to us, we may pass it down to the next generations unwittingly. But if we can acknowledge that, then that can be a catalyst for healing. And I always think that it's important to acknowledge too, we did not just inherit trauma. I have so much pride and joy that in the year 2022, after another pandemic, that I'm able to share these words and these teachings with you all via Zoom, using the latest technology that kind of Endurance shows to me perseverance, strength of heart, fortitude. We have inherited that as well. But we need to be aware that what we are doing now is going to affect the generations that are coming. So the first time I understood this, then I saw this and I was so excited. And I was talking to an elder, and he mentioned that in his day and age, when people reached a certain age, they would try to avoid using this word "neen," I, me, myself. And I thought that's curious because "neen" serves a perfectly logical and useful linguistic function. Me, it's referring to me rather than you or them or us, maybe excluding you or including you. But if you've ever translated "neen," I, me, myself, into Latin, it shows up as ego. And everyone here watching this tonight has dealt with someone who is egotistical, egocentric, egomaniacal, someone who is looking out for number one. How can I become more accomplished, more successful, more educated, more wealthy, more attractive, more accomplished than you? I'm looking out for number one. I'm looking to be better than you. I think many of you would probably agree that this is something that we're dealing with in our society, and we've been probably as human beings dealing with this for a long time. Self-centered behavior. And I think what those elders were trying to do and avoid using that term "neen" was to say that this idea of ego, this idea of me, I, me, myself, it doesn't actually exist. I am a link in the chain going all the way back and going all the way forward. I am, in fact, all of my relatives. And all of my relatives are me. I am inextricably interconnected to all of my relatives. All of my actions are going to affect them. The spiritual teaching that they had there was only Kije Manadu, only the kind spirit, the benevolent mystery, the creator. The spirit can say I, excluding you. Human beings can't. And I have to tell you, the moment I heard that teaching, I was thrilled because from the very first moment I started learning the language, I had heard about 7 generations. It is the name of educational institutes. It is a mandate in communities. It is on mission statements. And I finally got it. It clicked. This idea of all of my relatives, I would hear it in sweat lodge ceremonies, at pipe ceremonies. It finally clicked and it made total sense. But that joy was short-lived and replaced almost with anxiety. For me, at that very moment, I had spiritual and scientific proof that everything, not just that I'm doing, but anyone who is watching this program is doing. All of your actions, choices, decisions are going to affect someone coming 7 generations from now. Everything you choose and do will affect someone you will never meet, speak to, listen to, or hold. And I felt like grave responsibility because I wanted to be kind to these people. You know, this had answered one of these most important questions in life. Why am I here? Why was I born? I'm here because I'm related. They always knew we would be here in 2022. So the question for me was no longer, why am I here? It became how. How do I live in a way that brings peace and balance to my relatives, to my environment? How do I lead a life without contradiction? How can I lead a holistic life? And people all over the world for thousands of years have been asking this question. This is Mahavira in the Jain faith. He spoke of moksha, mukti, liberation from that cycle of karma that we spoke of earlier. For the Buddha, this was nibbana. Later, when it gets translated into the language of the priests, it'll become nirvana. the cessation of desire, the putting out of the flames of the desire, not always reaching for it, not always thirsting. For Lao Tzu and his contemporary Confucius, he spoke of living in accordance with the Tao, going along with the natural flow of the universe. Socrates in the ancient marketplaces of Athens discussed living the examined life, stating that the unexamined life wasn't worth living. Jesus spoke of that. The kingdom of heaven, that divine spark that he found within himself. And our ancestors spoke of Menobumatsu, the good life, a life of peace and balance, a life without conflict with your relatives or environment, a life without contradiction, saying one thing and doing another, a holistic life. This can also mean having good health, which is the natural consequence of leading a good life. Then my question became, well, how? How do I lead this good life? And this is what our ancestors called the Gichi Debak Konegewan. Another word for that is the Kaagegaabaw Vukelich. Gichi means great. Dib is to measure or relate. And akon is with a wood-like article in the hand. A lot of fluent speakers nowadays will giggle if they hear that word, debak konege, because it means a judge. Debak konege winini, debak konege wikwe. But what they're actually speaking about here is not a gavel. It's the sacred pipe stem. It's the okij. If you weren't culturally aware of it, that akon, it's implying that this is something that has been meditated upon and mediated with one of our most sacred gifts. The gift we were given to give thanks, to pray, to ask for help, to make relatives, to make relationships with new governments. You've probably heard of it as a peace pipe, but for us, it is a sacred pipe. So if I were to translate that word, it would mean the great law, the sacred law. Kaagegaabaw Vukelich would mean the eternal law. And we also call these the seven grandfather teachings. First one we'll look at is Debwewen, truth. For some people, the late Marlene Stately told me for her that word came from the de, the heart, and way, to speak. I'm speaking to you from the heart. I'm speaking to you from the very center of my being. Another way of describing this could be, and as a linguist, I want to make this point too. I don't think our ancestors would have used win. I think they would have conjugated this as a verb. 7/8 of our words are verbs, according to some research. So this would have been something that you do rather than something abstract. It's a way of being, it's a way of living, it's a way of acting. So Debwe would be a complete sentence in Ojibwe, capital D, period at the end. She or he tells the truth. There's no gender difference there in the third person. For Basil Johnson, Debe was to a certain extent, and way was to speak. He spoke of, I heard him speak of interpreters and isolated Anishinaabeg communities in the 1930s and 40s, fly-in communities. There were no roads that led there. You could maybe get there on an ice road with a dog sled or snowmobile in the winter, or by canoe maybe in the summer, but usually you would have to fly in. And in these communities, you would have a number of monolingual speakers. They were isolated, again, yet insulated. So they were still able to use their language and their culture. And when court would come once a month, they would set up in the band headquarters in the main administrative offices for the reservation, for the reserve, and they would have court. They would need to bring interpreters because you still had monolingual Ojibwe speakers. And when they were asked to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, there's a problem in the translation of that. Some of them said, I can't do that. What they were trying to say is, I can tell you everything that I saw, I witnessed, I was a party to, I heard. That may or may not be the whole truth. I can tell you my truth. And I thought that's a very beautiful way of describing that. But if we look at truth the same way that Socrates, that Jesus, that the Buddha, or Lao Tzu looked at truth, then we're talking about something eternal, something that has neither a beginning nor an end. And our language, which is the sound of our thought, it can't comprehend that. I wonder if the spirit of the language is actually saying, I cannot define the eternal to you. If you're using language, you're using the wrong tool for this. This is something that will have to be experienced. And when I began thinking about it, well, how did they pass down truth? It wasn't something you could think on. It wasn't something you could speak about. That's when I began examining the ceremony and the spirituality of our people. One of the most ancient ceremonies I found is called the Kaagegaabaw, the Vision Quest. And I found this one account written in Ojibwe in 1904. The man who is relating the tale was already an old man, so this must have taken place in the 1830s or 1840s. He recalled being woken up in his lodge in a Waginogan, a wigwam, by his father, who was holding two dishes. One dish had food in it. The other dish had a kakanje, charcoal. So the boy knows he's being presented a choice. And there's an incredibly important teaching there. No one can do it for you. No one can make you do it. If you choose to pursue a spiritual experience, grandma and grandpa can't have that experience for you. Your aunts and uncles, your parents can't. You have to do it. And you have to choose to do it. They can't make you. So if he had chosen food, he would have been fed breakfast, but he chose the kakanje. He chose the charcoal. The old man picked up the charred piece of wood and marked his face with it several times. And for the next 4 days and 3 nights, he went without food and water in isolation. He wandered around the woods. He went to a mountain and he fasted on top of that mountain. And if you've ever had this experience where you've had to fast for either spiritual or medical reasons, I think everything past day 1 without water gets very uncomfortable. I'm gonna have a drink of water. I promised myself if I ever could, I would have a drink of water. By the end of that first day, as the sun is setting, as it's getting cold, I wonder if this little boy is asking himself, if I were to get food right now, where would I get it? Where would I get clothing or shelter? How would I make a lodge? How would I get fire or even water? He's learning something incredibly important right now. What happens to a human being without food, water, clothing, or shelter? And he's learning this in real time. You will die. You will die without having those core human needs being met. For the rest of his life, if he meets someone without those basic needs being met, he will feel a real and genuine empathy for them. He will be able to say, I too have felt cold, hunger, thirst, and loneliness. If I can, I will help you alleviate your burden. When you hear of why our ancestors helped those people who did not know how to survive here on Turtle Island, it could be pilgrims, it could be the traders, it could be the people who ultimately came to settle and colonize this land. Why they helped them, it was because it was embedded in the spirituality. It was embedded in the ceremony. And now that he realizes that he will die without these basic core human needs being met, he asks himself, well, where do I get my food, water, clothing, and shelter? And it all comes from the land. He is learning the next sacred law we'll speak about, and that's Dabasindazawin. Humility. And Dabasindas, I am humble. What that word really means is Dabas, low. Ain is to think, and Dizo is of oneself. I think lowly of myself. And that may sound like low self-esteem in English, but what he is saying is that, wait, in the 1830s and the 1840s, I get my food and my clothing from the oasiak, from the four-legged, from the benashiak, from the birds, from the giguyak, from the fish. I get my shelter and my fire in Dishkode, from the trees, the mittigug. The trees are giving me the very oxygen I need to breathe. When I am ill, I seek out the strength of the earth. That's our word for medicine in Ojibwe. Comes mashkiki, comes from mashkau, strength, and aki, the earth. It's the strength of the earth that heals me. It's the asanig, the stones, the grandfathers that I stand upon, and the sacred water, the Nabi, is giving life to all of it. All of those beings now become relatives because he has relationship with them. So when you say a word like Indinwe Maganadok, all of my relatives, you're addressing all of them as well. And what he's saying is, I am not more important than the relatives who give me life. In fact, I think lowly of myself because I cannot survive without you. One of those etymologies I've heard for Anishinaabeg is, this comes from Nigagoon Siminakaning, Indian reserve in Ontario, that comes from Anisha and Abe. Anisha is for nothing, the one who is nothing without the creator, the one who is nothing without his or her relatives. Another one from the Lake of the Woods area is Anishinaabeg is the one who is humble before the creator, the one who does not exalt themselves above their relatives. And a humility like that brings respect. When I spoke earlier of my great-grandfather, the people at Turtle Mountain, Mekanakwajuing, were a buffalo people. The buffalo fed us, clothed us, gave us a home. So you have to ask yourself, well, would it be a good idea then to go out and kill all of the buffalo, or would that be catastrophically stupid? Manaji means to go, Manaji means to go easy on, to use sparingly, to take only what you need. And they took enough to feed themselves, to clothe themselves, to give themselves a home, to use the myriad of tools that the Mushkode Bijiki, that the buffalo gave to us. Then they left the rest behind. That's why when the people who arrive here to colonize, make Anako menacing Turtle Island, we'll see herds of buffalo, 60 to 70 million strong, at least. And in this word too, it is reciprocal. It is something that they do to one another. That idi is a reciprocal verb suffix. From an Ojibwe perspective, it was the buffalo who were going easy on us, who were acknowledging the sanctity of our lives as well. They were the ones walking in front of the bullets, of the guns, of the bows and arrows, of the spears. They were the ones who said, if we do not feed and clothe and shelter our younger siblings, the human beings, they will die. We will go easy on them. And I wonder if this boy at this time is asking himself, who else in my life does that for me? Who else gives me food, water, clothing, shelter, medicine when I'm ill? Be my parents. Why do they do that? Because they love me. You know, when I spoke about that sacred law of truth, I said, the language cannot define something eternal. And I think love is something eternal. I think what the language is trying to do here is describe what the eternal looks like in human beings. Zog means to emerge. This is a friend of mine's Indian name. The Anishinaabeg Winzoin, Zagachue. Zog is to emerge in the Aju as a mountain. And something I love about this image, this is the exact same thing this boy in 1830 would have seen. Again, minus the ships. This is the sleeping giant. I've had a chance to visit this place. And all of a sudden, Zagachue, The person coming from behind the mountain isn't necessarily a human. It's Gimashomasanon. It's our grandfather. And when the sun rises, who does our grandfather shine on? Everyone and everything. What we are seeing here is an example of what does Kishemana do, the kind spirit, the benevolent mysteries, unconditional love look like? It has to be something for everyone and everything. And we'll be entering the Zagibagagis as soon. The budding moon, that's what we call May. And here we have the Zag to emerge, and the bug is a leaf. Turns that into a verb, the Zagibaga. And as the days become longer, the sun is out, it becomes warmer. The thunder beings, the thunderbirds fly in their thunderstorms. And these seeds that have been planted will one day sprout. They will bud. This is Mundaman. This is corn, the wonder seed. And when this corn comes to fruition, the corn will feed a thief or a teacher, a priest or a prostitute. What we're seeing here is what does unconditional love look like? Rather than how we define it, what does it look like in action? It's something beyond words. It's something ineffable. Can never really describe in poetry and song, in painting and sculpture, that feeling that we have for our grandparents, our parents, our siblings, our aunts and uncles, our children or grandchildren. But it's something that emerges deep within us. And when it comes out, it's for the benefit of all of our relatives. And if you have that kind of love emerging through you, it will change the very center and core of your being. This is Zungide Ewen. It's our word for courage, bravery. And what that word really means is Zung, strong, and the De is the heart. He or she has a strong heart. And there's a ceremony that is taking place right now that radically transformed my view of what it means to have a strong heart. And it comes from these drums. The Dakota drums. And the story for this, it's dark, but its resolution is so inspiring. And it begins in the late 1860s or early 1870s, before the creation of North and South Dakota. It would just be the Dakota Territory, when a Dakota village came under attack by Chimokumana, by American soldiers. The soldiers were there to destroy the village. And it said, a woman, Wiaka Shintemi, tail feather woman, hid for her life in a pond. Some accounts she used a hollow reed that she kept up the top out of the water so that she could breathe while she hid for her life. Again, if she were discovered, she would have been killed on sight. They were not there to take prisoners. Some accounts she is there for 3 or 4 days. And it said that while she is underwater, she receives a vision from Wakantanka, from the Great Spirit, the Great Mystery, who tells her that the Spirit is very disappointed now human beings are living. Keep in mind, this is at the end of the Civil War. A terrible, terrible war here in the United States. And the Dakota are not just fighting the United States. The Americans are also in a terrible war with the Ojibwe. And we don't know how long that war had gone on. Maybe it had been 100 winters, maybe even 200 winters. But there had never been peace between the nations. And the Spirit told Tail Feather Woman that if the Dakota were to present this drum to the Ojibwe, it would bring peace to their nations. And Tail Feather Woman was able to reach the nearest Dakota village. She escaped undetected. and related her vision to the holy men there. And they began creating this drum that they would present to the Ojibwe, it said here in Minnesota, Mississauga at Lake Mille Lacs. And when the Ojibwe accepted this drum, when they sat at it and they sounded the drum, our word for drum, it comes from the de, the heart. Wait is the sound, characteristic sound or voice in a gun, a tool, an implement, an instrument. The drum is the instrument that makes the sound of the heart. When they sounded the drum together, it represented both of their hearts beating together. When they sang the songs with each other, they were speaking with one voice. When the smoke was raising from the chanupa, the opwagan, the sacred pipe, that represented both of their prayers and aspirations traveling to the heavens. And at that point, I said, no matter what happens, I shall never raise my hand to you again. They knew that you can't lead a life of peace if you are at war. And that even if the drum was not able to give me full peace, because these people had killed each other's relatives. These people had visited the worst of what war has to offer to each other. Pain, bereavement, anxiety, poverty, rage, hatred. For generation after generation, and saying, no matter what happens, my grandchildren will not fight your grandchildren. For me, strength of heart became, it was no longer, I am unafraid to go and fight Dakotas. It was, I am unafraid to treat Dakotas as a relative. This will show up in other spiritual traditions as being unafraid to love one's enemy. And we still no longer have war with one another. In fact, I've worked side by side with Dakotas, and these drums are still played. They will be played this week. They'll be played next week. They'll be played during the spring and fall seasons in acknowledgement of that spiritual treaty that was made with each other. That's what real strength of heart meant to me. And that kind of strength of heart will change the way you lead your life. Guayquadizawin is honesty and virtue. Really, Guayak is right, straight, proper, in order, and Atazi is to live a certain way. You're probably thinking, oh, truth and honesty. Our first law we spoke about was truth, and here's honesty. They're kind of synonymous in English. But what they're speaking here is not what I say, it's about how I live. Are my words in alignment with my actions? And if you want to know if I'm actually telling the truth to you, don't just listen to me, observe how I live my life. The truth will invariably come out. It always does. It's a holistic life where my words and actions are in alignment, not a life of contradiction where I'm saying one thing and then doing another. And if you are able to lead a life according to these grandfather teachings, according to this sacred, this great law, then every single one of your actions, every single one of your decisions will be positively beneficial for someone, not just now, but someone coming 7 generations from now. Each choice will be the right decision. You will act with true wisdom. You will act intelligently. You will act with vision. And if you are able to do that, if you are able to totally transform yourself, you will have an opportunity to change the world. If you change the way you relate to your family, to your clan, that changes the way your family relates to the community and how your community relates to the nation. But only you can do it. And when I'm asked, well, how do you lead this good life? How do you lead a life that can be positively beneficial for someone you'll never meet, visit with, speak to, or hold? How can you affect someone coming 7 generations from now? Seek out a life of truth. one with humility, where you do not exalt yourself above your relatives, to have respect for one another, to acknowledge the sanctity, the sacredness of your relatives' lives, to have that compassionate, unconditional love for one another, the strength of heart, the courage and the bravery to lead this life, to have the honesty, the virtue, and the righteousness, to lead a holistic life, a holy life. And you will truly act in a way that is enlightened, and is wise and intelligent. And in leading a good life, you will be giving a great gift to all of your relatives. You will truly be leading a life worth living. And on that note, I'd like to say, Miigwech Bizendawieg. That's how we would traditionally end a speech. Thank you so much for listening. I am incredibly grateful for the opportunity to address the Tamaquag Wabanda Iwe Wigamigong, the Tamaquag Museum, and Miigwech for the invitation to speak.
That was absolutely incredible. I'm really quite speechless right now, taking all of that in. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. We have just a couple of minutes. I don't know if anyone has any burning questions. I am quite speechless. But if there's any questions from the audience, you can feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat. We just have a couple minutes left. I know when you were talking about Vision Quest, it reminded me of Haskell. I did a semester at Haskell, and they have a class called Vision Quest. It's kind of like your College 101, that induction into the school. But I love the way that you described that. We do have a question from Adonis Spears. Adonis.
Bonjour, James, Miigwech.
Hello.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was so moving and beautiful and inspiring. So Miigwech, thank you so much. I'm curious to hear how some of these teachings are being integrated into contemporary tribal governance. I know that there is such a tension between these approaches to leadership and modeling these things for our children and being really intentional ancestors, and the ways that tribal governments kind of function in sometimes really dysfunctional ways. How do you see any examples of where tribal nations there where you are or anywhere in the area are integrating these teachings?
That is such a wonderful question. Two personal examples that I've seen in firsthand have been with the tribal colleges, which they are these sacred laws, these grandfather teachings are front and center with our governance is based on these 7 grandfather teachings. And I've seen that at Red Lake Nation College, where it is engraved in stone, as well as at Gawa Babi Ganekag, Gabiga Kandasa Wigmagon, White Earth College. I've seen it at Gaza Gasquad Jamaikag at Leech Lake as well. So I think where they're educating our people has been a wonderful example of that. And I think my approach to this too has been that the government is most likely a reflection of us. So when I suggest that it comes from an individual level, when we begin transforming ourselves, which is how I know our ancestors led their lives, was according to these sacred laws, then their Ogamawu and their leadership, their chiefs were a reflection of that. So I think this is a great opportunity and a catalyst for change from maybe a Western influenced government to a traditional one that was very representative of the people, which is basically what this government was based on, the reflection of how we governed ourselves. So, and it's great. And I love that name, Adonis. It's wonderful.
Thank
But
you. That's my grandmother was from White Earth and she named me. So thank you. Chimigwech, thank you.
miigwech gaygin. Thank you for listening tonight. I really appreciate that.
So I wish we had you for the entire night. That was really incredible. Thank you again so much for sharing your cultural knowledge, your language, your stories and memories. It's such a powerful presentation. And it's also been a really excellent complement to this year's Reading Across Rhode Island book choice, Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Boulay, to really help us understand more deeply the context of the story and many of the cultural concepts that the author introduces. Our director, Lorenz Spears, is this year's honorary chair for the Read Across Rhode Island program. And all of you can read along with us. If you visit rhodeislandbooks.org to learn more about this year's pick, the many companion reads and also upcoming events. So Katabatas James, thank you so much for your commitment to preserving this knowledge for future generations.
Miigwech.
And I also want to thank all of you for joining us for this Culture Bearer series. Before you go, I want to invite you back next month on May 10th for our third Culture Bearer presentation with Linda Coombs, a Quinawampanoag elder, who will share a presentation entitled Connecting with the Ancestors, a Process of Reclaiming Culture. So you can sign up for that on our website at tamaquagmuseum.org. And if you're interested in any more cultural programming, Tamaquag Museum offers a large variety of tours, visiting museum educator services, virtual presentations, workshops, professional development, all of it. And you can learn more on our website. Just give us a call or send us an email to discuss options. Tonight's presentation, along with many others, will be available on our YouTube page. So be sure to circle back and share with your family and friends. And I'm sorry we missed your introduction at the beginning, but we will put in your bio to that recording because we definitely want people to know you and reach out to you. If you didn't notice in the chat, I also put James' website so that you can connect with him more and hook up with his TikTok. Get your Ojibwe word of the day. I absolutely love that and look forward to those videos. Thank you again to our funders at the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, Rhode Island Charge Grant, the Pepito Opportunity Connection, the New England Foundation for the Arts, and other generous funders and donors like you. Please consider making a tax-deductible donation to the Tamaquag Museum. You can also support local Indigenous artists by shopping and sharing our online store. It's a branch of our program for Indigenous empowerment, so check that out. And Tabatni Anawayan, thank you from my heart. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And we hope to see you again next month for the third presentation in our Culture Bearer series. Wuni Nakan, everybody. Have a good night.
Miigwech. Miigwech, everyone. Miigwech Bizendawiek. Thank you so much for listening.